All right, welcome again. I know not everyone can eat that fast, so please continue eating. My name is Patrick Terry, and I'm the CEO for the Columbus Council on World Affairs. It's always a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for being here. We've got a great program. Let's first thank our mission partners. These are the organizations that not only support us year after year, but do it in a very generous way. We have Abbott Nutrition, and Wayne Wargo is here. We have Battelle, their CEO, Jeff Wadsworth. Thank you. CVG, Greif, Honda, Ebel Agency. Sebastian, it's your birthday. Wave your hand. Fantastic. You should see the Facebook photo of him from Throwback Thursday. That was in Germany. Kegler Brown, Vanita is here. Thank you, Vanita. And Nationwide, our chairman, Mark Hartman, is here. Please join me in thanking these mission partners. We also get support from individuals. We have a couple here that signed up just today. Jane Harf, who I know cannot be here, but recently signed up. And by the way, her daughter is working with Secretary Kerry right now as a special advisor on the Iran. Do you may know her, Mr. Okay, you do. So she's a Columbus native. Very sorry that she couldn't be here. And Eric Jankuski. Are you here, Eric? All right. No, new member. He's probably too shy. One of the things many of you don't know, and we always like to highlight, is that much of our work involves the young people of today, our future global leaders. And while we're busy preparing for the fall, in fact, our numbers will be doubling from 190 students to 350 next year. We're busy preparing for that, but the students are off on summer vacation. So we thought we'd bring you a little taste of the students. This isn't them from summer vacation, but before, as a way to provide some inspiration before today's conversation. So if we could play the video, let's do it. Welcome, Bruce and Lee.
It's coming.
The future.
The future.
The future.
Big.
Scary.
Amazing.
We can't predict it.
We can't predict it.
We don't know what problems will be there to meet us.
But thanks to you, we'll be ready.
We'll be ready.
Ready to be the leaders of tomorrow.
With the right knowledge.
The right knowledge.
The right skills.
The right mindset.
With your help.
With your help.
I believe I can develop new technologies.
Right here in Columbus.
Columbus.
That will empower small businesses
all over the world.
I believe I can become an engineer.
And solve
global water issues.
I believe I can play a role
in welcoming international visitors
to a vibrant city.
In helping immigrants succeed in our backyard.
In our backyard.
I believe I can make a difference.
I know I can make a difference.
I know I can make a difference.
I will.
I will.
I will.
Let's see if we can make a difference today. Thank you. It's pretty inspiring stuff. Today, we will have a keynote like normal. We're live streaming it around the world and around the country. Our partners at the World Affairs Councils of America, we welcome them here with us in spirit, but not in person, especially those at Jacksonville Council, Hilton Head, San Antonio, Dallas, and San Diego. You know, we're just as hot as you are, so thanks for being here via live stream. Thanks to our presenting and promotional partners here, the friends from Trinity Lutheran Seminary, who are actually the reason the ambassador is in town. He spoke last night at a conference, and I wanted to thank you both, Brad and Teddy, for bringing him to us. Please join me in thanking Lutheran Seminary for that. Thank you. All right, my distinguished pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who served as a U.S. ambassador of Egypt from 1997 to 2001, as well as to Israel from 2001 to 2005. He's been instrumental in formulating and executing U.S. policy toward the Middle East, especially around the peace process. Secretary of State John Kerry appointed Dr. Kurtzer to the Secretary's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. He retired after a 29-year distinguished career in the Foreign Service with the rank of career minister. He currently serves on the board for several organizations, from the American University of Cairo, the Middle East Institute, and the National Library of Israel. He's a co-author of several books about negotiating Arab-Israeli peace, as well as the peace puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace. Not only is he an author, a scholar, and a diplomat, he's also a baseball fan. And he knows some things about baseball, so much so that when Israel created a baseball league, they named him as the first commissioner. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Commissioner Daniel Kurtzer.
I want to thank Patrick for the introduction and to say how nice it is to be in Columbus. It's my first time. And go Buckeyes. I was told to say that as well. Avoid the word Wolverines at all cost. I had a chance this morning, actually, in anticipation of this meeting, to meet with your county commissioner, Commissioner Brooks. And we had a conversation about the relationship between what happens in places like the Middle East and what happens here. And of course, you know the reality. This is now a community that is absorbing asylees and immigrants, and how important it is that you have a World Affairs Council that continues to bring you programs that are not only educational, but that sensitize the larger community and involve the education, as you saw, of the children of the community to help deal with the problems of the absorption of these immigrants and asylees. So I congratulate all of you for the support you give to the council and to Patrick for the work that he does. I want to cover in a very few minutes to allow for a conversation, a topic of some difficulty and challenge, which I tentatively assigned the name The Shifting Sands of the Middle East, because of course, not only do the physical geophysics of the Middle East involve shifting sands, but it's a region undergoing such immediate and traumatic change that almost the things that you say today have to be modified tomorrow. And I want to look at this in terms of both the continuity and discontinuity of American policy. What are the kinds of things that our policymakers are challenged in doing, and whether or not there's any possibility of seeing some light at the end of this very dark tunnel. In so doing, I will focus a little bit more on the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace, not because it is the most important issue necessarily in the region, but because in some ways it has informed much of what we have thought about this region and what the United States has done in the region for so many years, that it's almost become a kind of symbol of whether or not U.S. policy is serious when it comes to acting and acting appropriately in the region. In so doing, I would start with the kind of obvious first topic, and that is there a context in which the pursuit of peace between Israelis and Palestinians makes sense? And is that context conducive, in fact, to the realization of larger American goals and interests in the region? And I need not tell you, those here who are following so closely world events, that what's happening in the Middle East is unprecedented at the speed and the breadth and depth of change, so that what we thought we knew just as recently as 5 years ago is essentially outdated. Now, what we did know 5 years ago, I picked that time frame because it's just before the onset of the Arab revolutions in 2011. What we did know as a country actually was not far off base. I mentioned last night that as a former diplomat, I hate WikiLeaks. But the value of WikiLeaks is that you now have a window into what we were reporting over the years. You can read the diplomatic reporting of American embassies in the Middle East and elsewhere. And you'll see, if you do pursue this, that our diplomatic representatives were telling Washington about the problems that we are now suggesting were the underlying reasons for the Arab revolutions, the dysfunction of Arab politics, the persistence of authoritarianism and repression, the inequality in economic access and wealth, the corruption and crony capitalism that marked many of these societies. In other words, endemic and persistent problems that seemed, at the time they were being reported, to be impervious to resolution, and in fact, so far have proved to be impervious to resolution. So the problem with the American policy approach to this region has not been a lack of knowledge or a lack of awareness. It's mostly been the befuddlement of what do you do in a situation where you are confronted by some very stark choices. Does the United States, for example, support emerging democratic movements within many of these societies? Or does the United States rely upon longstanding allies, many of whom, most of whom in this region, are the authoritarian, non-democratic leaders? And the choices we've made over these years have largely been in favor of the stability as opposed to the change mechanism in foreign relations. So the context which we're now facing is not necessarily of our own making, but it is one of which we have been aware over the years, and the dilemma of how to deal with it has been with American policymakers for decades, whether Democratic or Republican, whether involved in the Middle East or not involved. The challenge of what we do in this region has always been very difficult for our policymakers. And one needs to not spend a lot of time on this, but just to remind us that it's not only what we do, but look at now what's happening in this region with proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran taking place in the Syria-Iraq space and in Yemen, the so-called sushi wars, Sunni-Shia competition and involvement that has racked this region. The challenge of trying to see whether or not the nascent democratic movements in some of the countries where Arab revolutions started in 2011 can actually see themselves through. And we see how difficult that is because the only example that remains of the possibility of a democratic society emerging from these revolutions is in Tunisia. One had thought that Egypt might be the poster child for democratic change, but it has reverted to its own form of authoritarian government, and in some ways an even more repressive government than they had under Hosni Mubarak. And that has led to its own problems for the United States, because if previously the choice for the United States was, do we stay with stability or do we promote change, we are now facing differences of view even from the allies with which we've had strong relations over the years. Some of the most challenging relationships that we now have in the Middle East are with our traditional allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt. In fact, I was in Egypt in February, had a chance to meet with the new president, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and he said to me 5 times in the conversation that the relationship between Egypt and Israel is now better than the relationship between Egypt and the United States. Now, I tried to lighten the mood in this conversation. I said, well, this is a great success for the United States. So we helped you make peace with your neighbor, and now you're better friends with each other than with us. But it was a joke that didn't have significant humor in it, as I can tell from your reaction as well. So the reality is that U.S. policy not only faces the traditional dilemma of stark choices between change and stability, but now an even starker choice between among change, stability, and relationships with traditional allies. And that has led to an evaluation of the situation on the ground, both in the broader region and in the Israeli-Palestinian context, as one of persistent instability and a persistent problem in trying to act upon that situation in a way that might result in positive change. Now, in some respects, the way policymakers in Washington evaluate these issues is not unlike the way most, if not all of you in this room, do the same thing in your respective businesses and professions. You deconstruct issues and you look at whether or not it's possible to establish a context in which decisions are easier to make and to implement. You look at the issues related to what I would call in politics, local politics, but which also affect your relations with the local community. What are the substantive issues that divide, for example, Israelis and Palestinians? What are the spoilers, whether in business or in diplomacy? And then at the end, whether or not you in your businesses and professions, or we in the diplomatic area, both exhibit but also see from the people we deal with the kind of leadership that can articulate a vision and a strategy and a set of tactics, and then a program for implementing that strategy that has a chance of success. And if we apply that model to any of these crises, in particular, what I'll do for a few minutes is apply it to the Middle East peace process, an area that I hesitate to tell you I've been working on for 40 years, and it's not gotten much better, unfortunately. But if we apply that model to the Israeli-Palestinian context, it's not entirely hopeless. And this is not just a function of, the mode of diplomacy, which is always to think about, what can be done, the can-do approach. No problem is too serious to overcome. But it's also a function of the reality that the alternative, thinking about the alternative of a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is extremely dangerous and counterproductive. Whereas if we apply our mind and our thinking to developing creative solutions, at least we have a chance of success. The context then, which I've just outlined, is problematic. And one can't blame our policymakers in Washington or those in the region for hesitating before trying to force the parties or encourage the parties in the Middle East to make rather significant concessions that also involve significant risks. For both Israelis and Palestinians, the peace process is not just a question of functional arrangements that need to be worked out between them, but also involve very deeply held historical, religious, ideological narratives that would have to accommodate change, and therefore would be part of the risks that are taken that also would carry over into such functional areas as security or politics. So the context in which peacemaking might take place in the Middle East is, on balance, not conducive to an active peace process at the moment, let alone for an American administration which is beset by problems other than the peace process and has an agenda that's much broader and presumably deeper than involving just a major push for Arab-Israeli peace. Now, in this respect, I'm sure that even a bedridden John Kerry is quite anxious to get back on the road in the pursuit of peace. This has been one of his own priorities. But if John Kerry were to actually sit in the Oval Office and see the world as the president sees the world, then taking on the challenge of peacemaking in the context of everything else that's happening in the Middle East might seem to be running against the odds. Secondly, what I call the local politics in which a president and administration would need to assess the possibility of peacemaking also don't seem conducive to the idea of making a push now. The most important item on the president's agenda, as you know, is the pursuit of a settlement with Iran on the question of its nuclear capabilities. And as we've seen, even in recent weeks and months, it has raised a political firestorm already in Washington, even before there's an agreement to be debated. And it has caused a rather intensification of an already beset Washington that is divided so significantly between our two major parties. So for the president to undertake or to think to undertake an initiative in a subject like the peace process that itself is fraught with local politics would also seem to be beyond realistic. The third question is the question of spoilers, and they certainly exist quite substantially on both sides of the divide. Palestinians continue not only to pursue peace on the one hand, but also to be engaged in terrorism and violence. And even as we sit here, there is almost daily rocket fire emanating from Gaza. It happens so much now that we don't even read about much of it in the newspapers. I returned yesterday morning. I came straight from Israel to Columbus from a conference that I had been at the previous 5 days. And you read these things in the Israeli newspapers. It's almost daily missile or rocket fire from Gaza, and efforts by individual Palestinians in what is now being called an intifada of individual initiatives to wreak havoc and to do harm. So the local spoilers on the Palestinian side are still there, and the local spoilers on the Israeli side are still there. Israel produced statistics just the other day that suggested that Israeli settlement activity had intensified in the January to March period in a way that was far more extensive than in any previous quarter, both in terms of housing that was completed, but also housing starts. And so you have, although using different means, you have spoilers on both sides of this equation that are intent on preventing, whether it's Israeli leadership or American leadership, from promoting the prospect of peace. The fourth element, substantive issues, are they really bridgeable? And the answer, I think, in this respect is yes. Enough work has been done, both in negotiations that the parties have held and outside the negotiations, to suggest that even the seemingly most intractable issues, Jerusalem, refugees, security, are amenable to resolution. Not easy, but that there are ways in which both sides can realize at least the minimum requirements of their quest for national self-determination in part of their historic homeland, if they're willing to give up self-determination in all of their historic homeland. We did some work a few years ago with Canadian diplomats on Jerusalem, which, together with Israelis and Palestinians, yielded some very creative ideas in a resolution which can be called the non-sovereignty resolution. In other words, neither side would assert sovereignty, but both would have enough of a stake in managing Jerusalem together that it's possible to envisage at least a functional resolution, if not a sovereignty-based resolution. And one can find similar kinds of creative solutions in almost every other area. Security, which is very much on the minds of Israelis, has been a focal point for American government efforts. President Bush appointed the former Marine Commandant, James Jones, to look into this issue, and he worked very closely with the Israeli Defense Forces for a couple of years to try to anticipate what Israel's requirements would be in the context of a territorial withdrawal. And then President Obama appointed former General John Allen to do the same thing, in other words, continue the work of Jones. And the results have been quite impressive, although not yet publicized. So in almost every area of substance, it is possible to foresee solutions to what seem to be intractable problems. But what's the tie that would knit all this together? And that, of course, is that last factor of leadership. Does leadership exist in either community or in Washington to change the status quo in a manner that we've seen happen before, whether it was Sadat and Begin, or whether it was Rabin and King Hussein? In other words, the individual initiatives that translated what looked at the time to be the same kind of intractability that I've been describing into a peace process that succeeded, both with respect to Egypt and Jordan. And unfortunately, in this respect, one doesn't see, at least as of today, that leadership. One sees a right-wing government just elected in Israel that is far more intent upon solidifying its hold on the territories that it's occupied now for 48 years. During this conference, Prime Minister Netanyahu and several members of his cabinet addressed the conference and without any hesitation made clear that the area that Israel has controlled since 1967 is not going anywhere. that it belongs to Israel. In the case of one minister, she claimed it belongs to Israel by biblical right, and that was the end of the argument as far as she was concerned. And so you have on the Israeli side a period of retrenchment on the peace process rather than seeking a vision for resolving the dispute. And the Palestinian side of the equation is fractured. Palestinian politics are badly broken, both politically and geographically, a division between the West Bank and Gaza, a leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, who individually, personally, is quite committed to peace, but controls very little or commands very little support within his political system. And so the prospect of a leadership emerging on either the Israeli or Palestinian side is a long shot at best. And we return then to the question of whether the United States can exercise the leadership that we have sometimes exercised in the past to see change occur. And we run into the questions I raised earlier. Will this become a significant enough priority in an administration that's heading into its last now year and a half and has an agenda that is chock full of international and domestic priorities that are yet unfulfilled? So I don't want to leave you entirely pessimistic. We're still at midday. I tell people that I start my day optimistic and I only go to sleep pessimistic. So here we are around noon. I want to leave you a little bit more optimistic and suggest to you that there is one thing that Washington certainly can consider, and that is an approach that doesn't expect to result in a peace agreement, but rather sets American policy itself on a better course. In other words, don't expect that Israelis and Palestinians are going to do or say anything or accept what we do, but rather correct the imbalances in our own policy. And I would suggest there are at least 3 or 4 things that we can do unilaterally with no expectation of negotiations, but which would leave the situation on the ground in far better shape for our having done it. The first is what I would call tabling parameters. Parameters in this respect would be substantive views of the United States on how to resolve the conflict without going into the details. The details need to be negotiated between the two sides. But we know enough after working on this issue for decades and having watched how close the two sides got in 2008 when former Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas negotiated and came quite close to breaking through on the issues. We know where the parties can get to on their own. And in my view, we should articulate that as an American approach. In other words, establish a set of principles that we stand for, a border based on the 1967 lines that involves swaps of territory of equal value and size, a Jerusalem which is the capital of 2 states, but to the extent possible remains an open city, security for both Israel and Palestinians that includes multiple layers of international involvement, whether it's monitors or actual peacekeepers, or even what I call the deconstruction of the occupation. In a situation where Israel controls virtually all aspects of the economy, exports, imports, finances, currency, to start to very carefully unwrap and deconstruct this control so as to give Palestinians the ability to exercise more authority over issues that we will expect them to actually perform those functions when it becomes an independent state. And finally, what we can do unilaterally as a country is recognize independent Palestinian statehood in the United Nations. It's been curious to me why we have become so adamantly opposed to this, when in fact one of the roles of the United States over the years has been to try to address the asymmetries in the negotiation between these two sides. Just think of it. We're watching a negotiation between a major state in the international system that is occupying a people who are trying to emerge from that occupation in order to create an independent state, but are expected to do so through negotiations with the country that's actually occupying them. It's unprecedented in history. And so one of the roles of a third party, the United States or European Union or the UN, needs to be to address the basic asymmetries in the negotiations. We've tried to do that in the past by dealing with Israeli security concerns while favoring Palestinian political and territorial demands. And we can do so today by giving the Palestinians a political boost. It won't have much practical effect, but a political boost of recognizing their independent statehood. So there are things that we can do, at least 4 or 5, that in a sense are a bit divorced from what we normally associate with a negotiating process, but which could set our own policy on a much better footing. And if we did that, and even if the administration proves unable to then attract the two sides to negotiations, we would have left this region at the end of this administration in far better shape because we would have concretized an idea which is losing favor on both sides, and that is the idea of a two-state solution. A couple of years ago, in one of my graduate workshops at Princeton, where I now teach, I had my students do an exercise in whether or not there are alternatives to the two-state solution. And they walked into class the first day and said, "You may think that you have trapped us into proving the two-state solution is the best idea. We're going to try to prove that it's not," which I thought was great as a teacher. Let them try their best to show that there are alternatives. And 12 weeks later, they came out with the conclusion that there are alternatives, but none of them can work, and none of them is as viable as a two-state solution. So whatever we may think about one state, 3 states, federation, confederation, unilateral withdrawal, coordinated unilateralism, you name it. There's a list of such ideas. You come back time and again to the only tested idea for the past 75 years, and that is the partition of this area into 2 states in which Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace and security. It's not beyond the ability of them to achieve this goal, and I think a better American policy can actually help them do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. If you would join us, we're going to have time for a Q&A session. If you would like to write your question down on one of the note cards at your table, please do, and just raise your hand. We'll come around. If you prefer to tweet the, yes. Nitrate-free. And if you prefer to tweet your question in, you can do it at hashtag AskCCWA. While the ambassador's getting situated, maybe I could ask a question before you all bring some to us. You know, the issue of the Arab-Israeli, or the Palestinian-Israeli conversation is super complicated. And not to make it more complicated, but when you go outside of that context, you talked about the sushi wars, sort of the other things that are out there swirling around. If you're an Israeli negotiator or on the Palestinian side, what are the ones that are most on the minds of those negotiators? Is it the sushi wars? Is it ISIS? Is it Iran? You know, what is it? Maybe you could give us some
Well, the
context.
Israelis would divide their security concerns into 2. Primary among them is the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. Going back to the early 1990s, then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, in fact, first identified this as the real threat to Israel. Rabin spoke about it and then told President George H.W. Bush in his first visit to Kennebunkport, Maine, actually, that he wanted to see an end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, not because he was a member of Peace Now, but because he needed to unburden Israel from that problem in order to deal with the over-the-horizon issue of Iran. And Israel is concerned that not just that there might be a nuclear state in the Middle East, some of us would say another nuclear state in the Middle East, but also the fact that the Iranian regime has been so hostile to Israel, including its past president calling for Israel's destruction and the destruction of this, what they call the Zionist entity. But Israel is almost equally concerned about the instability along its borders. ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria are now literally up against the Golan Heights, which is just a couple of miles from Israel's northernmost area, the Upper Galilee. And there had been, not daily, but certainly several times a week, rocket fire coming from that area. Israel's concerned about the instability in Egypt spilling over. As we know, Egypt does not exercise full control over the Sinai Peninsula, and the violence which is now directed against Egypt in Sinai could just as easily cross the border in the other direction. And whereas Jordan, which has the longest border that Israel has with an Arab state, has been relatively stable since the beginning of the Arab revolutions, Jordan has always been considered a potentially unstable kingdom. And that the tentative stability or tenuous stability has now been impacted by the presence of perhaps 500,000 Iraqi refugees and upwards of 1 million Syrian refugees, on top of a very large Palestinian population alongside an indigenous Transjordanian population. It's a very potent mix. So the Israelis, they say paranoics sometimes also have enemies. They do have enemies and quite concerned about it. But I would add one note, which is there's a view among some in Israel, including within the security establishment, that notwithstanding these threats, this is exactly the time for Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. Because if you're having problems outside your house, fix the problems inside the house so as you focus your attention on what's happening outside. It's a debatable proposition, but that's the debate that's taking place in Israel.
Interesting, thank you. And I was thinking as you were speaking about the Iran threat, and the fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting in other areas, does that create an opportunity for Israel and Saudi Arabia to work together more than maybe I know they do, or do they, or what's the...
Well, they certainly are not only working more together, but they're doing more visibly. About a week ago, in fact, the man who was just appointed as the Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, Dr. Dori Gold, met in Washington publicly with a former Saudi general on the stage of a Council on Foreign Relations meeting. Now, all of us have known for years that the Israelis and Saudis have met in informal conferences and so forth, but the Saudis have always been quite reticent about allowing these meetings to be seen publicly. We did one in Princeton a few years ago where a former Israeli ambassador and a former Saudi ambassador agreed to participate on the same panel. The Saudi ambassador said, "I'll do so if you don't force me to shake hands with the Israeli ambassador." And I said, "Sure," and I stood between them, literally, so they wouldn't have to touch each other. And at the end of the panel, they actually did shake hands, so it was a great success. But these are few and far between, and I think we may see that accelerate now that, in a sense, both of them have the same foes and enemies.
Interesting, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Can you elaborate on the Saudi Arabia and Yemen conflict and its impact on the U.S.?
Yeah, there are a couple of aspects to emphasize here. One is Yemen has been an unstable country for at least 5 decades. Many of you will recall the civil war that occupied Yemen in the 1960s and actually drew Egypt in a rather significant way. And that even though the country was nominally unified after that war, in fact, the countryside was never pacified. My eldest son actually served in Sana'a, Yemen, for a short period in the American Diplomatic Service, and I asked him how often he got out of Sana'a, and he said, well, almost never, because that was a period where if you got out of Sana'a, you would likely be kidnapped, because it was a big business. You get kidnapped, you pay the ransom, and everybody ends up being happy. So Yemen has always been unstable and a very divided country. And what's happened lately is that a particular group, the Houthis, who have had long-standing grievances about the relationship between them and the center, with the support of Iran, they have gained some ascendancy, including basically taking over Sana'a and now the major port city of Aden. In one respect, for the United States, Houthi control of Sana'a is, I hope we don't have any Yemeni diplomats in the audience, is really not that important to us. But Houthi control over Aden is vitally important because of the possibility of the impact on shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb, the straits that separate Saudi Arabia from the Horn of Africa. And it's for that reason that we've bolstered our naval presence in that area, not just because of the inherent importance of maintaining the sea lanes, but also because of the possibility that it would represent a launching pad for Iran, which has been supporting the Houthis to just cross the straits and start up in the Horn of Africa as well, where we also have a large military presence. What's been interesting as the last note on this is the degree to which the Saudis have woken up to the threat. Saudis have traditionally relied upon us to carry their water, and yet now they are leading the military coalition without American assistance. And that's really quite a change in Saudi thinking and action in this region.
Great, thank you. The related, perhaps broader look on the current Middle East situation, the question is, what's the implication on the world economy and the price of oil, price and supply?
Well, if you promise not to run out and either sell short or, change your investment portfolio, because I'm not an expert on this. The reality is that the energy situation has really turned on its head in the last couple of years because of us, whether it's our own oil production or in the period when shale and other kind of deep drilling was more prevalent than it is today for economic reasons. We've had a tremendous impact on the energy markets, and that's why our own prices at the pump have reduced so much. I assume they are lower here in Ohio as they are on the East Coast. The Saudis are pumping at record levels, in large part because of the price. They want to make sure that their own budgetary calculations don't have an impact domestically when they're less able to produce what they were in the past. But they're having a hard time keeping up. And it becomes a potential issue in Saudi Arabia at what point this extraordinarily wealthy country actually runs into a deficit and they have to start borrowing. There are projections that this could occur as soon as 10 to 15 years from now. If we had talked about this 5 years ago, we would have thought of Saudi Arabia as a 50-year, surplus producer, and now those numbers are changing rather dramatically. It's also changing rather dramatically as a result of the voracious appetite of China and other countries in Asia. China has signed long-term energy deals with Iran and will be very aggressive as it is in its pursuit of mineral wealth all over the world in trying to take as much as it can from that region. So the changes in the energy market and the volatility in a different direction than we used to see volatility are quite substantial. But we're back as a big player, and that is probably the single biggest change on this issue that we've seen in the last 25 or 30 years.
When you mentioned China, hunger for energy and it deals with Iran, is it also doing that with Saudi Arabia? Or is it sort of one or the other, if you're China? And
there's always been a sense that it's one or the other. And with the Chinese long-term contract with Iran, the Saudis have been seriously hesitant about doing much with the Chinese. They play a little bit. They don't want to keep any customer totally out of their market. Mm-hmm. But traditionally, it's been a kind of either or, and it still is pretty much so.
Got it. Okay. Here's a question from the audience about education, and how can education help bridge the Israeli-Palestinian divide?
For many years, all of us thought that the solution to the Arab-Israeli issue was a government-to-government problem. and we ignored questions such as education or people-to-people activities. And the reality is that we were all wrong. Sure, governments will have to ultimately make the decisions, and they're responsible for the negotiations. But at the end of the day, those governments have to assess that their publics are ready to support and encourage what they're doing. And that means you've got to get people together, and you've got to start educating them away from seeing the other as an enemy and rather see the other as a potential neighbor. We're not looking for, peace and harmony and,
Group hug.
Yeah. What we're really looking for is the ability to see across a border and understand that it's live and let live. And then maybe over time, actual cooperation. And education is one of those critical issues. I know in our assistance programs in the Middle East, our government assistance programs, we have always invested in education, but we haven't invested enough. And that has two implications. One is not just in terms of making people smarter, but it's also informing them with respect to values. Back in 2002, the United Nations Development Program came up with an initiative to ask Arab intellectuals to define the problems in their societies. And interestingly, the Arab intellectuals in what became the first of 5 human development reports came up with 3 deficits that needed to be fixed. One was the deficit of freedom. They're not able to organize and speak and pray and do things freely. The second was a deficit of women's empowerment. They recognize very much that they're asking half of their societies to basically stay home, and that's inhibiting their development. But the third deficit was a deficit in what they called education and knowledge, that their systems were producing those who were asked to memorize things rather than to think and to create. So you have a substantive issue of how you educate, and then you have the politically important issue of educating, in a sense, for peace. And in both areas, there's a significant deficit.
How about here? Do you find that, have you looked at U.S. education enough to know whether we have a deficit in creating graduates that are open and able to help solve this?
Well, none of us likes to pat ourselves on the back, but we're actually doing better than kind of everybody else in the world. We're still a place that is a magnet for foreign students, particularly at the graduate level. Even in undergraduate education, where I think there's more of a debate about its quality. People want to come and study here. Doesn't mean we should be complacent, but I think we do a relatively good job. I'd also note in terms of area studies, which has been my own field, 9/11 really gave a boost to the idea that languages and studying other cultures, it must be part and parcel of what we do. The growth in Arabic language interest or other hard language interest, and the growth in area studies, I think, has been quite valuable. And I know it's been in all the universities, including, I'm sure, at Ohio State. I got that in. I wanted to mention it. So, sitting next to the chairman of the board, I have to say that. So.
We see it even at the high school level with our student groups, which is focused on cultural awareness, just in terms of the demand. Right. And the exciting thing for us is that the young people see it as a need and something they want. So that part inspires me.
Yeah, I've been bowled over by the incoming students at Princeton who come in with 2 or 3 years of Arabic. They now have it in high school. Or they'll come in with a year of Arabic and they have done a summer program somewhere. And so they're really well launched into having the facility to actually engage in the region in the language or in research in the language.
I'll have this be our last question. Kind of changes the tone a little. It's about baseball. And as I was reading it, I got an idea about this, it's people to people. And, what about a Israeli-Palestinian baseball league, and you could be the commissioner.
Yeah.
So first of all, yeah. Here's on the note it says, some levity, please. Could you tell a joke? Please talk about baseball in Israel and
Sure.
how you came to be the commissioner.
First of all, I'll tell you, after 30 years in the diplomatic service, and I retired, and then I was appointed as the commissioner of baseball. I have 3 grown sons, and I told them about it, and they said, well, it's about time you did something worthwhile with your life. So we are a baseball family, as you can hear from that. We thought that there was a niche that we could find in Israel. There's great interest in soccer, obviously, and in basketball, but there's no summer sport, and we figured, baseball is the ultimate summer sport. What we failed to realize is that there's no interest in baseball in Israel, and we were not good enough or able to last long enough financially to build that interest. The league actually ran for 1 season in 2007. We had 6 teams. We did a 42-game schedule, and Major League Baseball, that came to visit us twice, said that we were far progressed beyond where Europe had been when they started baseball 40 or 50 years ago. They were quite amazed at the quality of our play. But that quality was achieved by bringing in 105 of the 120 players from outside Israel, and that's where the costs went up substantially. I mentioned on the way here that I am ready to be the Major League Commissioner because I faced in 6 weeks in Israel every problem that a Major League Commissioner has faced in 100 years of professional baseball. I had a strike, I had a cork bat, I had protested games, you name it. But we managed to get through the season barely, and then we folded financially. So there is still some interest. I had on my board, I guess I can mention the Yankees here. It's okay. I had on my board a couple of senior executives from the New York Yankees, and we're still trying to figure out whether or not we can revive the prospects of baseball in Israel. There was a thought at the time of encouraging an Israeli-Palestinian dimension to it. And in fact, there's an organization in Israel called the Peres Peace Center, named after the former President Shimon Peres, that does have an annual exercise of baseball games between Israelis and Palestinians. But you watch them play and you try to figure out what sport is it that they're actually engaged in, because it's not really baseball as we know it. So it would be a big challenge to do that.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. Although this is the ambassador's first time to Columbus, there is a connection that makes me remember that it's such a small world. On the way over, he said, by the way, my son was a Wexner Fellow. He received the scholarship that's from Mr. Wexner and their family to study Jewish studies.
At Harvard, yeah.
At Harvard.
Yeah.
So I guess we're all connected in one way or another.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ambassador Kurtzer. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.